Hello everyone, welcome to my channel.
In a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago, 50 cameras flashed nonstop in my face like a rapid-fire execution squad, while the air hummed with the suffocating scent of scandal and expensive perfume. I am Elena Vance, 34 years old, and I sat at the defendant's table watching my own flesh and blood prepare to bury me alive under a mountain of fabricated debt. My mother, Lillian Vance, leaned toward me with a predatory glint in her eyes, her voice a sharp whisper that cut through the judicial silence as she hissed that, in just a few more minutes, everyone would finally see the look of absolute failure on my face. Beside her, my brother Julian smirked, with a sickening entitlement, declaring loudly enough for the reporters to hear that as of today, I was officially bankrupt, and my legacy was over. Standing behind them like a dark shadow was my Aunt Beatrice, the true architect of this nightmare, who had hired two of the most ruthless lawyers in the city, Marcus Sterling and Silas Vane, to ensure I had no way out. The courtroom was packed with the city's elite, all waiting to see the golden girl of the Vance family fall from grace. I forced my hands to remain steady on the mahogany table, even as the walls felt like they were closing in. The tension reached a breaking point until Judge Richard Sterling looked up from a thick manila folder and asked one chilling question about a document I had filed exactly 2 days ago. A question that caused all 50 cameras to suddenly swivel away from me and point directly at my mother's pale, frozen face. Before we dive into the rest of my story, I want to know what time it is and which city you are tuning in from right now, so I can see how far this journey has traveled. If you are already hooked by this betrayal, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. The path to this courtroom started 6 months ago on the gray afternoon of my father Arthur's funeral, when the grieving process was abruptly interrupted by the cold reality of corporate greed and a betrayal I never saw coming. My father had built the Vance empire on integrity and hard work, but as soon as the last clod of soil hit his casket at Graceland Cemetery, my Aunt Beatrice appeared like a vulture in a designer veil. She didn't offer a hug or a kind word. Instead, she began whispering poison into my mother Lillian's ear about how my independent green architecture firm was a drain on the family's consolidated resources. I had spent a decade building my company from a one-room office to a leader in sustainable design, purposely refusing to rely on the family trust to ensure that my success was my own. This autonomy had always fueled Julian's bitter jealousy as he watched my projects win international awards, while he fumbled every simple hotel renovation my father handed him. Julian was the quintessential silver spoon failure, a man who spent more time in high-stakes poker rooms than in the boardroom, yet he remained my mother's undisputed favorite. Lillian, blinded by her favoritism and easily manipulated by Beatrice's calculated lies, began to view my professional distance as an act of cold-blooded treason against the Vance legacy. Beatrice, who served as the family's CFO, convinced my mother that my father had left behind a secret debt of $5 million, and that I was the only one who could repay it by folding my firm back into the family conglomerate. At the post-funeral reception, while guests toasted to my father's memory, Beatrice pulled me into the study and laid out a series of documents that would have effectively stripped me of all my patents and assets. When I refused to sign their predatory agreements, Lillian's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred, and she told me in front of the remaining guests that I was a parasite who didn't deserve the Vance name. I left the family estate that night with nothing but my dignity, unaware that Beatrice was already moving to the next phase of her plan, forging my signature on a series of fraudulent loan applications. They spent the following weeks carefully planting a trail of digital breadcrumbs that suggested I had been siphoning money from the family's hotel chains to cover up massive losses in my firm. Every time I tried to call my mother to clear the air, Julian would intercept the message, feeding her more lies about how I was planning to sue her for her remaining inheritance. The psychological warfare was relentless, designed to isolate me from my allies and make me look like a frantic criminal in the eyes of the Chicago business elite. I watched as my father's old friends stopped returning my calls. Their silence a deafening confirmation that the Vance machine was working overtime to erase me from the social and professional map. It was a cold, calculated assassination of my character, orchestrated by the people who shared my DNA but possessed none of my father's heart. I realized then that my childhood home had become a fortress of deceit, and the only way to honor my father was to protect the integrity he had taught me, even if it meant declaring war on my own mother. Beatrice had even begun contacting my construction vendors, telling them that my credit was no longer good and that the Vance family would not be responsible for any of my firm's debts, effectively strangling my ongoing projects. I spent nights staring at old family photos, trying to find the moment when my mother's love had turned into a commodity, but the only answer I found was the cold reflection of Aunt Beatrice's ambition in the background of every image. The funeral wasn't just the end of my father's life. It was the birth of a conspiracy that would eventually lead me to the cold mahogany table of the federal court, fighting for the right to exist in an industry that now whispered my name with scorn and suspicion. 4 months before the trial, a heavy midnight knock at my apartment door shattered the fragile silence of my sanctuary and signaled that the legal wolves had finally been unleashed to tear my life apart. I opened the door to find 2 stone-faced process servers standing in the dimly lit hallway, handing me a thick envelope containing an involuntary bankruptcy petition that sought to strip me of everything I had spent my adult life building. Lillian and Beatrice had not acted alone. They had spent a fortune hiring Sterling and Vane, a legal duo, notorious for their scorched earth tactics in high-stakes probate and corporate disputes. The petition was a masterpiece of creative fiction, alleging that I had personally guaranteed a $5 million loan from the family trust to bail out a luxury eco-resort project in Wisconsin that had allegedly failed. In reality, that project was thriving, but Beatrice had used her administrative access to the company's internal servers to create a ghost ledger that showed massive, non-existent losses. Julian had been the one truly hemorrhaging money, losing staggering amounts at private baccarat tables in Las Vegas, but Beatrice had expertly laundered those gambling debts through my corporate accounts to make me the scapegoat. As I sat on my floor, surrounded by the legal documents, I realized that my own mother had signed an affidavit claiming she had personally witnessed my financial desperation, a lie so cold it made my blood turn to ice. The local Chicago news stations were tipped off within hours of the filing, and by the next morning, my face was on the front page of every business journal, accompanied by headlines that questioned my sanity and my ethics. My investors, sensing a scandal that could tank their own reputations, began exercising their morality clauses to withdraw their funding, leaving my firm on the brink of an actual collapse caused by this manufactured one. Beatrice called me that afternoon with a voice that sounded like velvet-covered sandpaper, offering to help me avoid prison if I would simply sign over my architectural patents to Julian's shell company. She spoke about preserving the family name while she was actively dragging it through the mud, her hypocrisy so thick I could practically taste it through the phone line. I refused to engage with her, hanging up, as I watched a news helicopter circle my office building, realizing that they weren't just trying to take my money. They were trying to erase my identity. The isolation was total, as even my closest friends in the industry began to distance themselves, fearing the wrath of the Vance family's influence and the relentless PR machine Beatrice had mobilized. I spent the following weeks living on caffeine and spite, digging through every email and bank statement I could find, looking for the one loose thread that would unravel their web of lies. It was during these long, desperate nights that I discovered the first clue, a series of offshore transfers that didn't match Julian's gambling patterns, but pointed toward a much larger, more sinister scheme involving my aunt's personal ambitions. I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for my company. I was fighting a war of survival against a predator who had been planning this since long before my father ever took his last breath. The pressure was mounting daily as Sterling and Vane filed motion after motion to freeze my assets, claiming I was a flight risk and that I intended to hide the stolen millions in foreign accounts I didn't even possess. My landlord even received a letter from the Vance legal team suggesting that my lease should be terminated due to my alleged criminal activities, a move designed to leave me homeless and broken before the trial even started. I stood on my balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline, feeling the weight of the city pressing down on me yet. Within that crushing pressure, a diamond of resolve began to form in my chest. If they wanted a fight that would go down in the history of the Illinois courts, I was prepared to give them a war that would leave no survivors on the other side. 2 months after that night, I stood in the glass-walled lobby of the Vance corporate tower, watching as Beatrice and Lillian walked past me with a phalanx of security guards as if I were a common trespasser in the house my father built. They had moved the legal battle into high gear, filing an emergency motion to seize my firm's physical assets and servers, claiming that I was actively destroying evidence of my supposed embezzlement. The air in the lobby was thick with the scent of lilies and cold corporate ambition, and I could see the stares of the employees who used to look at me with respect, but now looked at me with a mix of pity and suspicion. Julian followed behind them wearing a custom-tailored Brioni suit and a smirk that suggested he had already spent the money he hadn't yet stolen from me. I saw him whispering to Silas Vane, the more aggressive of the two lawyers, who was holding a stack of court orders that felt like a death warrant for my professional future. They had successfully frozen all my personal and business accounts, leaving me to rely on a small hidden emergency fund my father had told me about years ago, which was the only reason I wasn't yet on the street. My lawyer, Nathaniel Reed, met me in the corner of a nearby park because we suspected Beatrice had bugged my office and my home with professional-grade surveillance equipment. Nathaniel looked weary, his eyes bloodshot from staring at the mountain of forged documents Sterling and Vane had produced, and he told me that the judge was leaning toward granting the receivership. I realized that Beatrice had anticipated every move a standard lawyer would make, which meant I had to stop playing by the rules of a system she had already corrupted with her influence. I watched my mother get into her limousine, her face a mask of regal indifference, and I felt a final snap in the cord that had always tied my heart to her. She wasn't just a victim of Beatrice's manipulation anymore. She was a willing accomplice who preferred the comfort of a lie to the inconvenience of her daughter's innocence. That was the moment I decided to go underground to find the people who operated in the shadows where Beatrice thought she was safest, and to gather the kind of evidence that a courtroom couldn't ignore. I told Nathaniel to keep the legal front active while I disappeared for a while, knowing that Beatrice would see my absence as a sign of surrender and become careless in her arrogance. The hunt was no longer about defending my name in a boardroom. It was about exposing the rot at the core of the Vance family before they could bury the truth under another $5 million of lies. I began meeting with former employees of the Vance Trust people who had been fired by Beatrice for asking too many questions about the offshore accounts and the sudden disappearance of my father's private ledgers. These forgotten voices provided me with the missing pieces of the puzzle, revealing that Beatrice had been siphoning funds into a shell company registered in Delaware for years, long before Julian's debts became an issue. I spent my days in a small, windowless basement apartment I rented under a false name, surrounded by stacks of financial records and grainy surveillance photos slowly tracing the path of the stolen millions back to Beatrice's personal accounts. Every time the Vance legal team thought they had pinned me down, I slipped away, moving from one safe house to another, while Nathaniel kept them occupied with endless procedural objections in court. It was a game of cat and mouse where the stakes were my life and my father's legacy, and I was determined to be the one who stayed standing when the dust finally settled on this family war. 1 week before the trial began, The last pillar of my defense crumbled when I looked through a telephoto lens and saw Caleb Thorne, my lead project manager, shaking hands with Aunt Beatrice at an exclusive country club in Lake Forest. Caleb had been with me since the beginning, the man I trusted to oversee the structural integrity of my most ambitious designs, but it appeared his own integrity had a price that my aunt was more than willing to pay. My heart felt like it had been hollowed out, as I realized he had likely been the one providing Beatrice with the internal access codes she needed to plant the fake financial data into our server archives. When he showed up at our temporary office the next morning, he couldn't even meet my gaze, his voice cracking as he talked about unforeseen complications in our upcoming project bids that would likely lead to more losses. I didn't confront him then. Instead, I played the role of the defeated CEO, letting him see me scrambling to find documents that I had actually already secured in a safe deposit box months ago. I needed Beatrice to believe that her spy had successfully neutralized my defense, making her and her high-priced lawyers overconfident as they prepared for the final hearing. That afternoon, I received a secure tip from Tom2 Miller, the forensic expert I had hired in secret, who had been tracking Julian's movements across the casinos of the Mojave Desert. Miller had found something far more valuable than gambling receipts. He had found a connection between Julian's creditors and a shell company that Beatrice had been using to funnel money out of the Vance Trust. The betrayal was a family tradition, it seemed, as Beatrice had been robbing my mother blind, while simultaneously convincing her that I was the one with my hand in the cookie jar. As I sat in a dimly lit diner on the south side reviewing the grainy photos and encrypted files Miller had provided, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction that the truth was finally within my reach. I knew that Caleb's testimony would be the centerpiece of Sterling and Vane's case, and I planned to let them build their entire narrative around his lies before pulling the rug out from under them in the courtroom. The psychological toll of being hunted by your own family was exhausting, but the anger was a fuel that never ran dry, keeping me awake as I mapped out the final confrontation. I was no longer the daughter or the architect. I was a strategist preparing for a siege, and I knew that the only way to win was to let them think they had already won. Caleb left the office that evening with a folder of evidence I had purposefully left for him, unaware that he was carrying the very seeds of his own professional and legal destruction. I watched him drive away, feeling a strange sense of peace, knowing that in 7 days the flashbulbs would finally capture the truth instead of the manufactured scandal. Beatrice had even invited the local socialites to the trial, turning a legal proceeding into a public execution of my character, but her arrogance would be her downfall. I spent the remaining days memorizing the financial flowcharts Miller had created, ensuring that I could explain every cent of the stolen money with clinical precision when my turn came to speak. The Vance name was about to be dragged through the mud one last time, but this time I wouldn't be the one holding the shovel. I would be the one holding the mirror to their greed. My mother's betrayal still stung like an open wound, but I had learned to cauterize the pain with the cold reality of the evidence I now held in my hands. 48 hours before the hearing, I stood in the freezing rain of a Chicago shipyard, meeting Tom2 Miller behind a row of rusted shipping containers to receive the final piece of the puzzle. He handed me an encrypted flash drive containing a series of recorded phone calls between Beatrice and Julian, where they discussed the final solution for my firm and laughed about how easy it was to manipulate my mother into signing the bankruptcy petition. Listening to my own aunt describe me as an expendable asset, while my brother joked about what he would buy with the proceeds of my liquidation, was a pain so sharp it felt like a physical wound that would never heal. But Miller had found something even bigger, the original unedited dishuk of my father, which Beatrice had hidden in a safe deposit box under a false name, instead of destroying it as she had claimed. That document explicitly protected my firm from any family interference and revealed that my father had known about Julian's gambling debts, setting up a trust that Julian could only access if he remained sober and debt-free for 5 years. This was the motive Beatrice had to destroy me. I was the only thing standing between her and the total control of the Vance fortune once she finished draining my mother's personal accounts. I spent the next 36 hours locked in a secure room, with Nathaniel Reed meticulously cross-referencing the recordings with the forged bank statements to create a timeline of the conspiracy that even a child could understand. We didn't sleep, fueled by black coffee and the sheer intensity of the evidence we were assembling, knowing that we only had one shot to strike before the Vance machine crushed us for good. We filed a supplemental evidence package through the court's electronic portal at 3:00 a.m. on the day of the trial, bypassing the standard discovery process by labeling it as evidence of ongoing criminal fraud. I knew that Sterling and Vane wouldn't see it until they arrived at the courthouse, giving them no time to prepare a defense or warn Beatrice about the storm that was about to hit their smug faces. When I walked into that courtroom 48 hours after receiving the drive, I felt a cold, crystalline clarity that I had never experienced before in my life, a sense of power that came from knowing the truth was finally on my side. I didn't look at my mother or the cameras. I looked at the judge, knowing that the document on his screen was a ticking time bomb for the Vance family's reputation and their legal standing. Beatrice sat there in her pearls and her arrogance, her two lawyers whispering confidently in her ear, completely unaware that the ground was already crumbling beneath her feet as the judge began to read our filing. The atmosphere in the room changed the moment the judge's eyes widened his gaze, shifting from the documents to Beatrice, with a look of profound disgust that signaled the beginning of the end for their scheme. I felt Nathaniel squeeze my hand under the table, a silent acknowledgement that our gamble had paid off, and that the wolves were about to become the prey in their own forest of lies. Julian was still leaning back in his chair, whispering a joke to one of the reporters, but his smile would soon vanish when he realized that his secret life was about to be broadcast to the entire world. The wait was finally over, and as the judge cleared his throat to speak, I knew that my father's true legacy was about to be vindicated in the most public way possible. 15 minutes after the secret dossier was opened on the judge's bench, the federal courtroom in Chicago fell into a deathly silence so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat and the ragged, sharp whistling of Aunt Beatrice's breath through her teeth. Judge Sterling slowly removed his reading glasses, his eyes piercing through Marcus Sterling and Silas Vane, as if to strip away their professional masks, before he spoke about the true origin of the suspicious transactions that occurred on the very night my father passed away. Julian's smug facade began to shatter into 1,000 pieces of terror as the real financial figures from Las Vegas casinos appeared on the large courtroom monitors, showing that the $5 million had never touched my firm's accounts, but had been incinerated at baccarat tables under his own name. My mother Lillian sat frozen in her seat as she listened to the audio recordings of Beatrice's voice, giving Julian step-by-step instructions on how to forge my digital signature on the wire transfer orders, a double betrayal that caused her to nearly collapse in shock. The two opposing lawyers began fumbling with their paperwork, sweat pouring down Silas Vane's forehead as he realized he was standing on the precipice of a federal disbarment for complicity in grand financial fraud. The judge ordered Detective Miller to take the witness stand, and every word of his testimony felt like a hammer, nailing the coffin shut on Aunt Beatrice's career, exposing a multi-year conspiracy to hijack the will and drain the family trust through offshore shell companies. Beatrice tried to scream about a misunderstanding, but her voice was drowned out by the indignant murmurs from the gallery and the cold professionalism of the federal marshals who were already closing in. I sat there with a cold, dry-eyed clarity, watching the empire of lies they had built so meticulously crumble in public humiliation before dozens of media cameras. The evidence Miller had uncovered regarding Beatrice blackmailing her own sister-in-law with secrets from Lillian's past forced my mother to realize she was nothing more than a pawn in her sister-in-law's ruthless endgame. Justice was no longer a luxury on a piece of paper. It was manifesting in the frantic gasps of the guilty and the terrifying silence of a dynasty that had just been torn apart. Julian slumped over the table, his hands shaking with a desperation that had replaced his usual entitlement, while Beatrice was escorted to a corner to await formal arrest by the U.S. Attorney's Office for felony fraud and identity theft. This counterstrike didn't just save my company. It exposed a rot that had been festering in the Vance name for decades, a painful but necessary truth to end a nightmare that had lasted for months. When Caleb Thorne saw me from the back of the room, he silently turned his head away, knowing his own career had ended alongside the lies he had sold to Beatrice for a country club membership. The judge's gavel struck the bench with a sound like a death knell for their schemes, and I knew that from this moment on, my life truly belonged to me once again. Beatrice's triumph had lasted only a few minutes, but the consequences she would face would last for the rest of her life behind federal bars where her cunning would hold no value. I took a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief wash over my body while my mother began to sob and call my name, but the sound was now just a distant echo from a past I had decided to leave behind forever. The legal wolves had been muzzled, and the predator had finally become the prey in the very forest of lies she had planted. 1 hour after Judge Sterling's final gavel fell, dismissing the bankruptcy petition with prejudice and ordering a full criminal investigation into the conspirators, I walked out of the courthouse into the uncompromising Chicago sunlight, feeling like a survivor emerging from the rubble of a massive earthquake. The afternoon sun reflected off the glass skyscrapers I had once dreamed of designing, but now my mind held only a profound and quiet serenity that I hadn't felt since childhood. My mother Lillian chased me down to the stone steps, her eyes red from crying and her voice trembling as she tried to grab my arm to plead for a reconciliation, a chance to start over like the days when my father was still alive. I stopped and looked at her gently but firmly, removing her hand from my sleeve, staring directly at the woman who had been my entire world, but chose to stand with the enemy to destroy her own daughter out of a blind, toxic favoritism for Julian. I told her that the Elena Vance she had tried to bury truly died in that courtroom, and the person standing before her now was a stranger who owed nothing to the past or the tainted Vance bloodline. Julian and Aunt Beatrice would soon be facing the cold reality of federal prison for financial fraud, document forgery, and embezzlement, a price entirely earned by their bottomless greed. I have already decided to establish a legal defense fund dedicated to young entrepreneurs who are being oppressed by their own families, naming it the Vance Truth Foundation, to turn this stained name into a source of inspiration for actual justice in America. My story isn't just about business success. It is about the sacred value of self-reliance and the courage required to stand against the people you love most to protect what is right. Never allow anyone, whether they are parents or siblings, to define your limits or use emotional blackmail to ransom the career you spent years building with your own sweat and tears. Truth may arrive late, and it may cause you pain so deep you feel you might shatter. But when it finally reveals itself, it is a cleansing fire that burns away every lie and leaves you with the wings of true freedom. I walked away into the bustling crowds of downtown Chicago without looking back, once knowing that, from this day forward, my life would be designed by me as sturdy and sustainable as the green buildings I will continue to create. The consequences for Beatrice and Julian are real and permanent. They will lose every asset to compensate their victims and live with the lasting scorn of a society they tried to deceive, while Lillian will live the rest of her days in the silence of her own regret. The core value I want to share is this: family should be a place of love, but if that place becomes a cage of deception, you must have the bravery to break the bars and find yourself again. Thank you for listening to my journey. Remember that justice can be delayed, but it will never be forgotten if we are persistent enough to fight for it until the very end. Stay strong on the path you have chosen and never let someone else's shadow extinguish the light inside of you. Life is a blueprint and you are the only architect. Do not let anyone else hold the pen to draw dark lines across your future. Goodbye to the Vance family. Goodbye to the lies and hello to the first day of my real life starting right here under the bright Chicago sun. The conclusion of this drama serves as a powerful reminder that professional integrity and personal boundaries are the most valuable assets an individual can possess when facing a toxic family environment.